Dr. Matthew Potter, it's wonderful to have you here. And I sit here in the Markets Field this evening, and you, of course, out there in the lovely pastures of County Limerick. And we're here this evening really just to discuss pandemics. We sit in the middle, I suppose, of something that's unprecedented from a modern perspective and in living memory. But of course, these are nothing new throughout the course of history. And we have to go back, I suppose, to the start of modern history to find the very first one of these that afflicted Ireland.
Well, that is correct. Sadly, pandemics have had enormous influence on world history. And one of the first historians to make a study of pandemics was William H. McNeill, who's one of the pioneers of world history. And he wrote a book called Plagues and Peoples, which actually introduced a large audience to the role of disease in influencing events worldwide for the first time. I suppose two major examples that come to mind would have been the devastation wrought by Western diseases when when America was discovered in 1492. The Americas had been completely isolated from the rest of the world since human beings had first arrived there. So when the Spaniards, the Portuguese arrived, they brought with them a variety of illnesses and ailments that had been endemic in Europe and Asia and Africa for centuries. And there was therefore a certain immunity acquired to them. But when they were introduced to the Americas, the population had no immunity. And it's thought that the population of America North South was reduced by up to 90%. Perhaps 100 million people died as a result of these catastrophic pandemics. The same thing happened, of course, when Europeans first came to Australia and New Zealand and the Pacific Islands, and indeed Siberia. So these were all parts of the world that were that had never been exposed to Western pandemics. But once the connection was made, their populations were decimated. In more modern times, and we'll be looking at later on, the role of cholera in world history has been highlighted. Cholera was endemic in India for centuries, but only moved out of India in the early 19th century. So again, the peoples of Europe and other parts of Asia had no immunity to cholera, and they died in enormous numbers. And I suppose the COVID-19 is in that tradition as well, in that it originated in a certain part of the world and then moved globally. But of course, the whole key to these pandemics is mobility. When a serious disease can be chronic in a certain part of the world, such as cholera was in India, for example, or the bubonic plague was prevalent in parts of Central Asia. But then when they move out of the place of their incubation and development, they can wreak havoc. And in the case of the Black Death in the 14th century, the numbers that died could be measured in the tens of millions.
And that's what makes, I suppose, the early plagues in Ireland that little bit more quizzical, because we didn't have a whole lot of trade with other countries, and we were very insular back in around the 500s.
Well, the first recorded plague in Irish history is actually bubonic plague, and this occurred in 544, 545. Because of course the Irish annals are an incredible historical source, because the Irish annalists recorded just about everything that was going on, and so therefore we have some very accurate datings of the incidence of both disease and famine in Ireland in the early Middle Ages and the later Middle Ages as well, of course. This plague of 544 to 545 was actually bubonic plague. It was part of a worldwide pandemic called Justinian's plague, called after the Roman Emperor Justinian, who reigned from 529 to 565. And this plague devastated the entire Western world and caused almost as many deaths as the Great Black Death of the 14th century. There was then another great plague in Ireland from 664 to 668, which is thought killed as many as a third of the population of Ireland. What that plague did highlight, though, was in fact that Ireland was fairly connected to the rest of Western Europe, because this is, remember, the Golden Age, and there were huge numbers of scholars from England and from the continent living in Ireland at the time of this great plague of 664 to 668.
Of course, Matt, the American plagues are one thing, and we can see how people would have brought the viruses and the various diseases with them when they were discovering these new worlds. But I suppose the original Irish plague, which would have happened in around the year 500, that was a little different, because Ireland didn't have a whole lot of foreign trade and was pretty insular at that stage as well.
Well, that's an interesting point, actually, because some historians would argue that the reason that the Irish survived the onslaught of colonialism better, we'll say, than the Native Americans or the Aborigines in Australia or the Maoris is in fact that we had immunity to diseases that were endemic in Europe, because of course we were in Europe. So say, for example, in the 16th century, when and the time of Cromwell in the 17th century, when the English government made a sort of a fairly concerted effort to settle the country and to get rid of as many of the native Irish as they could, they didn't have the assistance of the pandemics, which they did have in their depredations in America. So the Irish were able to survive the Irish already were immune to diseases. So therefore, you could argue that's one of the reasons why we still exist, whereas the Native Americans, certainly in North America, and the Aborigines in Australia were reduced to a tiny minority in their own country. So ironically, diseases and pandemics probably saved the Irish in that we were already immune to them. But you're quite right in what you say, though, that when Ireland was afflicted by plague in the 6th century AD, it was a very devastating event. This was known as Justinian's plague, called after the Roman Emperor Justinian, who reigned from 529 to 565 AD. It afflicted the whole of the old world, Europe, Africa, and Asia. It caused deaths of tens of millions of people, probably almost as many as the Black Death of the 14th century. The first reference to this plague in Ireland was 544, 545 AD. It recurred then in the later 550s. The Irish analysts, you see, were very accurate in reporting events. We have a pretty good account of what happened in Ireland even 1500 years ago by reference to the annals. There then was a huge plague in Ireland in the years 664 to 668 AD, that's the 7th century AD, of course. And actually, by that time, Ireland had much greater connectivity to the rest of Western Europe, because much of what we know about this plague, which is known as the Great Plague, actually, is due to the fact that many English and European visitors to Ireland were victims of this plague, and their deaths are recorded not only in the Irish annals, but also in the annals of contemporary English and European annalists. So this plague is thought to have killed as many as a third of the population of Ireland. Now, while Limerick as such did not exist, there was no Limerick city, there was no County Limerick, but what now Limerick County was inhabited by a population known as the Ifigenta. But we can be certain that Limerick, what is now Limerick, was afflicted by these terrible epidemics. And of course, Justinian's plague continued to afflict the world until around the year 800 AD, and Ireland was no exception. But then from about 800 AD to about 1345 AD, the old world, Europe, Africa and Asia, was relatively free of pandemics until the Black Death of the middle of the 14th century.
And perhaps, that's probably this phrase that we keep hearing even today, this whole area of herd immunity at that point had probably built up to the level that it didn't afflict people anymore after that particular point, and that it took a completely new plague to actually bring us down. And that brings us in then into that awful period in European history around the Black Death.
That's right. I suppose it's interesting to note that, first of all, there was a great famine in Europe between 1314 and 1318, which killed millions of people, and here in Ireland would have killed quite a lot of people as well, although it's hard to quantify the numbers. So the population was already weakened by the time of the Black Death's arrival, and it arrived in Ireland in 1348. It came to Limerick in 1349, and it is thought that between 40 and 50% of the population of Limerick would have died, Limerick City that is, would have died as a result of the bubonic plague. And the bubonic plague is another example of how connectivity had actually brought about a pandemic, because for centuries China and Europe had little or no contact except through indirect contacts. But the great Genghis Khan and the Mongols had established a world empire that stretched from Korea over to Hungary. And for the first time in human history, China was connected with Europe.
These would have been the Silk Routes, yes.
Yes. And the result was, of course, the beginning of the worst pandemic in world history, the Black Death, because it originated on the Mongolian steppes and was brought to Western Europe then by the Mongols. And as you mentioned already, it was devastating in its consequences because there was no immunity. And a famous Irish friar called John Klyn, who was based in Kilkenny, he recorded the Black Death as it afflicted his locality and afflicted his own particular monastery. And then, of course, the record goes dead. He recorded a particular sequence of events, and then there's no more, because John Klyn himself died of the plague. But the sad thing about the plague was it didn't just come in 1340, 49 in American finish. I think it continues about 1351. It kept coming back then. It recurred a number of times, particularly in 1361. Everybody thought around 1351, oh, that's the plague is gone, that's great now. Thousands of people died, but we can get back to normal. But again, there was no new normal because, in fact, it recurred in 1361. It actually caused more destruction the second time around because people were absolutely horrified that it was back again. It kept coming back then until by 1400 the population of Limerick was only about half of what it had been before the plague. And of course it then continued to recur in succeeding centuries until the final instance of the bubonic plague in Ireland was as a result of Cromwell. Of course, Cromwell, we can blame him for a lot of things because of the massacres that he carried out, but he also was responsible for bringing both famine and plague to Ireland in the 1350s because inevitably war, famine and plague travelled together. And during his terrible campaign in Ireland from 1649 to 1650, the numbers that died as a result of famine and disease were almost as great as those that were killed in battle. And after the departure of Cromwell from Ireland in 1650, his son-in-law Ireton was at the head of the Cromwellian forces. He led the Cromwellian army to Limerick in 1651. After a 3-month siege, the city was captured. And it's thought that around 5,000 died at this time, not only from the effects of warfare, but also from famine and from the bubonic plague, which some might say was the occasion of vengeance being visited on Cromwell's army, because Henry Ireton, his bloodthirsty son-in-law, who had led the Cromwellian army that captured Limerick, he actually died of the plague himself while resident in Nicholas Street in Limerick, and was brought back to Limerick. But that was the end of the plague in Ireland. It never came back after 1655.
And I suppose when we look at it now, and set against what we now know, and the type of numbers and the type of figures, and how people try to humanise now very much the figures that we're hearing on our own TV screens every night. When you say half the population of Limerick died,
right.
Can you imagine the fear that would have struck into people that didn't understand the transmission? That they didn't have a Tony Holohan coming on the television every night telling them that they needed to wash their hands or whatever. So, this must have been tied up in folklore. It must have been tied up in witches. It must have been tied up in all of that.
Yes. Well, there was, you're quite right, it created enormous feelings of panic and fear and horror. In many parts of Europe, for example, the population turned on the local Jewish community and massacred many thousands of them because they blamed them. It was thought, of course, to be a punishment from God, that the sinfulness of man was being visited by this pestilence in the same manner as the biblical plagues. It was thought also to be a judgment on the wickedness of various rulers of the time. For example, the period of the plague, of the Black Death, was also a period of 100 Years' War between England and France. But the horrible thing was, of course, that they didn't stop. The war did not stop because of the plague. They just stopped fighting for a few years. But then once the plague had diminished, they resumed their bloodthirsty warfare again. And of course, the whole of European civilization was affected by the bubonic plague, and Ireland was no exception. In Ireland, it had one of the major results it had in Ireland was that the Anglo-Norman advance was very much arrested because the plague affected the Anglo-Normans much more than the Irish. The Irish didn't live in towns to any great extent. They lived in scattered rural settlements. Therefore, they were much less likely to be infected. On the other hand, the Anglo-Normans lived in cities like Limerick, like Cork, like Waterford, like Dublin. They died in greater numbers. Of course, the Irish then took this to mean that God was on their side, that the cursed Gauls, the Norman invaders, the Anglo-Norman invaders, they were suffering God's punishment. And of course, this then gave the native Irish a great deal of encouragement in their recovery of their lands from the invaders.
Sounds like a great narrative anyway for them in any respect. So we move on then, Matt, and of course we all know, and history has taught us of the great famines
right.
in Ireland, and of course the main great famine that we all think of, but there were famines before that, and I know there were famines in the 1700s particularly.
Yes, there was a huge famine in Ireland from 1740 to 1741. Which again is thought to have killed about 400,000 or 500,000 people. The reason it's forgotten completely almost is because, of course, it was dwarfed by the Great Famine of 100 years later. But again, there are horrific accounts of the numbers who died of both starvation and also of disease, because, of course, it is thought that more died of disease in the Great Famines of the 1740s and the 1840s than died from from actual starvation. Then, of course, between the two great Irish famines of the 1740s and 1840s, there was the arrival of perhaps the most virulent disease since the bubonic plague, which was cholera. And cholera had been confined to India for centuries. Then, as a result, largely, in fact, it has to be said, of the British establishing their control over India, it began then to spread to Western Europe. And when it arrived in 1831-32 in Western Europe, its effect was similar to that of the bubonic plague. There was no immunity to it. People died in huge numbers. The great cholera epidemic, as it's called, of 1832 in Ireland, is thought to have killed between 30 and 50,000 people, which again was an enormous number of casualties. The difference, of course, being by the 1830s, there was now a greater understanding of how pandemics worked, whereas in the time of the Black Death, it was thought to be the will of God, God's punishment, and so on. Medical knowledge, while still not, of course, at the level it was to become later on, by the early 19th century, it had advanced to the point where, for example, people were aware that quarantine was an important way of slowing down infection. And of course, the bubonic plague from the middle of the 14th century onwards had accustomed Europeans to dealing with these terrible epidemics. So they had a whole suite of measures they could take, such as, for example, they would quarantine areas if the plague broke out or cholera broke out in a particular town or village. They would seal off the whole area. They would actually seal off particular parts of towns. So to that extent, they were better equipped, and The cholera epidemic afflicted Limerick, of course, in 1832 to a large extent as well. Huge numbers died, and of course it was noted that the numbers that died from the poorer parts of Limerick were greater than the richer parts. That was incidentally one of the reasons as well why cholera struck fear into so many people, because there were chronic diseases around for centuries, such as dysentery, typhus, smallpox. Now, people didn't exactly ignore them, but they were used to coping with them. And in particular, the upper classes were much less likely to contract them than the lower classes, because contrary to what one might learn, or rather pick up from the likes of the horrible histories, the well-to-do throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern period were conscious of hygiene. They did bathe frequently. They did look after their clothing and their houses. So they were much less likely to pick up these infections than the poorer classes. When cholera arrived, it's a waterborne disease, of course. It afflicted all classes, including the upper classes. So, for example, the Grand Duke Constantine, the notoriously tyrannical brother of the Tsar of Russia, who was Governor General of Poland, he died of cholera in 1831. I mean, people like him didn't normally die of diseases that the poor died of. So the fact that the wealthy were being affected caused a huge panic, and also, of course, speeded up the search for a cure. So that by the end of the 19th century, while cholera did keep coming back, like the bubonic plague, they had actually discovered that it was waterborne. And of course, one of the main ways of combating cholera was to provide a decent water supply, which Limerick did acquire well before the end of the 19th century. So then the cholera, while continuing to be a serious killer, was far less of a threat than it had been when it first arrived.
And that, I suppose, brings us nicely into the early part then of the 20th century. And
right.
I suppose we had come through a period of British imperialism all the way through the 1800s,
right.
and you had the Boer War, and that then led into the First World War. But
right.
an interesting number, I suppose, is that more people died in the so-called Spanish flu, and I call it so-called Spanish flu, of 1918, 1919, 1920, than died in the whole of the First World War.
Correct. I suppose to look at the nomenclature first, the Spanish flu was so called because during the strict censorship period of the First World War, news of epidemics, of illnesses, of anything at all that was deemed to be damaging to morale was not made known to the general population. In actual fact, the Spanish flu, so-called, is thought to have originated perhaps on the Western Front. It certainly did not start in Spain, but the first reports of it came from Spain because Spain was neutral in the First World War, and therefore censorship did not apply to Spain. So for this reason, it became known as the Spanish flu. But it had a mortality on a par with the bubonic plague, insofar as between 50 and 100 million people died worldwide of the Spanish flu. Of course, you must remember the population of the world was far greater in the early 20th century than it had been in the 14th century. So that, say, I think 75 million died of the bubonic plague in the 14th century. The world population was about 350 million. Whereas by the time of the Spanish flu, 50 or 100 million died, but the population of the world was about 1.25 billion. So the proportion of the world's population that died was much less. That, of course, didn't make it any less terrible. Here in Ireland, the official number of casualties for the Spanish flu was 20,000. That, again, would be compared favourably with the 50,000 that died of the first great cholera epidemic, but it's thought that the 20,000 is an underestimate. It could be more like 25 to 40,000 that died. Here in Limerick, then, on the other hand, my good friend and fellow historian Tom Toomey is one of those who has done some research on the Spanish flu in Limerick. Another of my good friends and colleagues, Des Ryan. Tom Toomey estimates that the number who died of the Spanish flu in Limerick between 1918 and 1919 was, he put a figure of 709 on it, but he also thinks that was an underestimate and that the real figure could be more like 1,000. Again, to go back to your point with regard to the bubonic plague, I mean, could you imagine the horror and shock we would feel here in Limerick if we learned that thousands had died from the COVID-19 epidemic? So far, nationally, the figure is about, I think, 1,400, which is still a terribly high number. But just to give an idea of the fear that the Spanish flu would have engendered, that around 1,000 died in Limerick city and county alone.
And that on the back of the numbers that also died in the First World War, and I think particularly of the likes of Cuna and how badly an area like Cuna was affected during the First World War.
Strangely enough, Cuna was also very badly affected by the Spanish flu. From memory now, I think about 14 young men from Cuna died in the First World War because, of course, they had a big seafaring tradition, so they would have died in naval combat. But it's thought that around 8 or 10 people from Cuna also died during the Spanish flu. And the population of Cuna at that period was around 200. So Cuna emerged from the twin evils of war and pestilence, having lost a very large number. Now, Tom Toomey's research would indicate that, again, not surprisingly, I suppose, that the largest numbers of casualties in the Spanish flu pandemic in Limerick occurred in the wintertime in October and November of 1918. Then there was a period of recovery, and then a second wave occurred in the spring of 1919. Again, of course, we're hearing a lot at the moment about the danger from a second wave. And in this discussion, we've already discussed how these horrible pandemics had a habit of coming back. And in the case of the Black Death, it kept coming back repeatedly, not just simply a second time. But happily, if that's the right term to describe, once the Spanish flu came back the second time, it vanished and never recurred.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, and I know from meanders that I would have had through Mount St. Lawrence Cemetery that there are whole areas of Mount St. Lawrence Cemetery where you will identify that graves were opened literally within days of each other from particular geographic areas of the city and county where people were buried, and it's quite obvious from that in that time frame that apparently that area would have been badly hit by the Spanish flu. So we move it on then, Matt, and I suppose we're almost coming back up to date at this stage. There have been various epidemics, I suppose, and we've gone through the polio, we've gone through TB in the meantime as well, and they would have all had major effects, of course, right across Ireland and the Midwest as well, wouldn't they?
They would. Tuberculosis, now in particular, was one of the great scourges of human civilization for centuries, until the middle of the 20th century, when it was possible to find a cure for it. And it's interesting to note that while the bubonic plague was called the Black Death, the simple reason it was called the Black Death was because the unfortunate victims, their bodies were afflicted by these sort of black, sort of horrible lumps all over their bodies. The tuberculosis was known as the White Death, or the White Plague, in more or less as a contrast to the Black Death. It would have been, of course, a chronic condition in that it was around for centuries, but that didn't, of course, mean it was any less feared. And the numbers who died cumulatively over the centuries come to several hundred million. Here in Ireland, whole families, of course, were decimated by tuberculosis. You mentioned Mount St. Lawrence Cemetery, and that brings me to a very interesting example of quite a well-known Limerick family that was devastated. If you look at Michael R. Cleary, the founder of Cleary's department store in Dublin, he's buried in Mount St. Lawrence Cemetery, and his grave is marked by an enormous Celtic cross, very close to the mortuary chapel. But if you look closely at the monument, you will see that poor Michael Cleary buried his wife and all of his children before he himself died. All of his children except one who survived him, and his wife and all of the children died of tuberculosis. From memory, I think there may have been 7 or 8 children. So when you think that Michael R. Cleary, a man of considerable wealth, a man who would have had access to good diet and would have had lived in very clean and very hygienic conditions, but yet his family were decimated, were actually destroyed by the White Plague, by TB.
And for anybody that's looking to locate that grave, it's actually located on the right hand side of the chapel as you come up the main road into Mount St. Lawrence Cemetery. Quite an interesting grave, and actually there's quite a few captains of industry located around him. The O'Callaghan grave is there as well at on that side. So Matt, I suppose TB, ravaged the country, and of course TB and Noel Brown are two terms that are put in the same sentence always, aren't they?
They are, because it was Noel Brown. I mean, the cure had been available for some years before Noel Brown came on the scene, but it was Noel Brown who put in place the infrastructure, really, and committed the expenditure to actually tackling it, so that during his period as Minister of Health from 1948 to 1951, the mortality was severely reduced, and continued then to decline steadily then in succeeding decades, right through the 1950s and 60s. Of course, this would have been the case worldwide at the time. One of the interesting developments of the 20th century was the development of what were known as sanatoria. The sanatorium was a purpose-built hospital for the treatment of TB, and a lot of the cure as well as medication was thought to consist of fresh air and exposure to plenty of sunlight, and also, of course, it also meant that the TB patients were separated, quarantined, as it were, from the rest of the population as well. Of course, there was a big stigma in having TB at this period because it was highly contagious. So if one member of the family died from it, oftentimes it would be concealed as much as possible from the neighbours and so on. But it ravaged, a lot of families, and I suppose one of the most famous families in the 19th century that was ravaged by TB were the Brontes, of course, the famous literary family of Haworth in Yorkshire. They all died of they eventually all died of TB. In fact, poor old Reverend Patrick Bronte, who was incidentally from County Down, he survived all of his children because they all died of tuberculosis.
Just musing here around TB, and I suppose the coincidence, and maybe it's more than a coincidence, that TB arrived on so quickly after the end of the Second World War, and that the Spanish flu had arrived so quickly after the ending of the First World War. I'm sure that they're not unrelated.
They're not. Warfare always resulted in an increase in mortality from obviously from battle casualties, but also from famine and from disease, because the three went together the whole time. And if you look, for example, at some of the greatest conflagrations in history, the notorious 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, which killed more people than any other war in European history, except for the First and Second World Wars. In fact, some historians think that 30 Years' War killed more than was killed in the First World War. But the vast bulk of the casualties were, in fact, from starvation and from disease, because armies moved around, bringing disease with them. They also, of course, devastated crops, which in turn caused famine. Famine then, of course, also weakened the population and then made them more susceptible to disease. The three kind of fed off each other, really. And I suppose to go back to the example of America, which is very interesting. When the Spaniards arrived, when Columbus and his colleagues arrived in America, initially the Native Americans would not have, they would never have, of course, have encountered Europeans before. Initially, they were completely taken aback by the fact that these people had arrived apparently by sea, which was not a mode of transport they used very much. They were riding horses, which they had no familiarity with. They had wheels, which they had never seen before. But then, when these people were able to move in and start conquering them, but then native people began to die of disease, it seems to be again a visitation from not in their case from God, but from their gods. So when you see your own people were dying off like flies, these superhumans that had arrived were riding these strange creatures called horses, and they had wheels and they had guns, of course, which the Native Americans didn't have. They weren't dying of disease, of course. I mean, what were you to think? It was the same. It was always the same as this Martians arrived. And incidentally, there's a very interesting thing as well, where in the classic tale, The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, when these terrible Martians arrive, the reverse happens actually. They cannot be defeated by the peoples of the earth, the Earthlings, but it's human viruses and germs that kill them. So just when the human race is giving up in despair, these awful creatures begin to die because they have no immunity to our illnesses.
Do you think this would be a good point to call a halt?
I think we're in danger of depressing all of our viewers because they're not content with having to deal with COVID-19, and they're now being told that it's actually one of the mildest pandemics in human history. So I think you're right.
Matt, as always, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I'm sure we'll pick this one up again sometime. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, and thank you.
God bless.